Emile Okal. I'm a professor of Earth Sciences at Northwestern University in the United States, and the topic that I want to say a few words about is the so-called tsunami earthquakes, and these are earthquakes which generate tsunamis which are larger than one would predict by just measuring their standard magnitudes, and they pose a very significant problem to scientists and civil defense officials, people involved in tsunami warning, because most of the efforts in tsunami warning still consist of analyzing the earthquake which occurs and is recorded faster than the tsunami arrives, and trying to infer a potential forecast for the size of the tsunami which may follow. And so these events which defy the rules, which in a sense are rogue events which do not adhere to the particular laws which govern the growth of seismic events, pose a very significant problem. Examples include the 1992 event in Nicaragua, and it was typical, for example, that this earthquake was hardly felt on the beaches, or when it was felt as a very minor earthquake that would correspond to maybe a magnitude of 5 or so, which doesn't warrant evacuation in terms of tsunami danger. And then later, 40 minutes later, waves came which were as high as 10 meters, destroyed many buildings on the beaches of Nicaragua and killed 170 people. And this example gives you the challenge that these events constitute, especially because in the near field, the scientific community, the scientific tsunami community in the near field passes the message that the shaking is the warning. Despite all the efforts that we make at providing real-time forecasts and things like this, the best way to evacuate and to save your life when faced with a tsunami situation is to take the matter into your own hands, and if you feel a strong shaking near the beach, to evacuate to higher land. But then what happens if you don't feel it, or if the shaking is very deceptive and does not carry the entire threat of that earthquake? And this is where we have a challenge, scientific challenge first, and we've devised a number of methods which try to measure as fast as possible characteristics of these events, which may indicate that something anomalous is brewing. And in particular, to get a little technical, we can measure the energy of the first waves which are received, or the first seismic waves which are received, and compare them with the duration of these same waves. And if we deal with one of these events, the energy is probably going to be deceptive and the duration longer. And if we try to match the two, we can see that there is something wrong there. And this is one way to try to determine these events. As a post-mortem, after the fact, we can study them and learn a great deal of scientific information about them. And generally speaking, they fall into several categories. And one of the questions that we are trying to ask is if there is a regional signal. For example, if the Nicaraguan coast was hit by one of those in 1992, does this mean that Central America as a whole on the Pacific side is threatened by more tsunami earthquakes? And it seems, through a combination of some understanding that we have of the conditions under which these events may be taking place, the geological conditions under which they may be taking place, and the empirical observation of more such events since 1992, it seems that the answer is yes. And in 2012 there was an earthquake in El Salvador, Honduras and Nicaragua, and near the Fonseca Gulf, which shared some of these controversial properties. it went largely unnoticed because fortunately it was a smaller event. It didn't affect too much of the coastline, and it affected a section of the coastline both in El Salvador and Nicaragua where very few people live. So in the end it killed nobody, which was a big sigh of relief, and it destroyed very little infrastructure because there was no infrastructure to speak of to be destroyed. So it went largely unnoticed, but what we've learned is that along the same Central American subduction zone, along the same Central American plate boundary, there seems to be a regional trend towards towards the repetition of such events. And then if you look in the historical record, in 1902 in Guatemala there is an event which may share some of these characteristics, where the shaking was very moderate and hardly reported, even though we know that it was present, that there was an earthquake, and then there was a tsunami which affected about 100 kilometers of coastline in El Salvador. There seems to be a regional signal that will be confirmed in places such as Java, which had two such events in a matter of 15 years, and possibly the northern section of Peru as well. Now, the take-home message to the population is that yes, the shaking is the warning, but the shaking can be deceptive, and a very important part of the qualitative, personal, human interpretation of the shaking is to try to be aware of the duration of that shaking. If for example you feel a very mild shaking which could remind you of a very small earthquake, typically magnitude 5 or so, but this shaking lasts for a long time, like a minute or more, whereas a typical magnitude 5 should last just a few seconds. If you try to notice something which is inherently wrong, but this weak shaking lasted for a long time, it's a very serious signal, and it would warrant immediate evacuation. And that is, I think, the message that I would give to the populations of Central America, that you have to be aware not only of strong shaking as a harbinger of a tsunami which may come, but also of any kind of anomalous situation where weak shaking may last a long time, and that should be a red flag, and that should command immediate evacuation. Thank you.